This book makes the case for why all violence, including really extreme things like serial unaliving and serial essay, is not random, is not inborn evil, but is the result of neglect, abuse, humiliation, suppression of feelings, etc., in very young children. This specific chapter is about a serial unaliver who also did sexual things with his victims, and it kind of works back to explaining where it all began. This happened in the 1960s in West Germany. Between the ages of 16 and 20, this young man had unalived a number of children in an indescribably cruel manner. This is quoting from a book that is out of print, but was called The Self-Portrait of German Bartsch. Born November 6th of 1946, the illegitimate son of a tubercular war widow and a Dutch seasonal worker, Karl-Heinz Sardoninski, later Jurgen bartsch, was abandoned by his mother in the hospital, which she surreptitiously left ahead of schedule. She died a few weeks later. Several months thereafter, Gertrude Bartsch, the wife of a well-to-do butcher in Essen, entered the same hospital to have major surgery. She and her husband decided to take the abandoned baby in spite of the reservations voiced by the adoption officials in the welfare office on account of the child's dubious background. Such strong reservations that the actual adoption did not take place until 7 years later. The new parents raised the child very strictly and isolated him completely from other children because they didn't want him to find out that he was adopted. When the father opened a second butcher shop with the idea of setting Jurgen up with a business of his own as soon as possible, the Frau Bartschen had to work there. The child was taken care of by his first grandmother and then by a series of maids. When Jurgen was 10, his parents put him in a children's home in Rheinbach, where approximately 20 children were living. At the age of 12, he was taken out of this relatively pleasant atmosphere and put in a Catholic school, in which 300 boys, problem children among them, were subjected to strict military discipline. Between 1962 and 1966, Jurgen bartsch unalived 4 boys, and he estimated that in addition he made more than 100 unsuccessful attempts. There were minor deviations in each unaliving, but the basic procedure was the same. After he had lured a boy into a former air raid shelter, which was now empty, not far from the bartsch home, he beat the child into submission, tied them up with butcher's string, manipulated his what's between his legs, while he himself sometimes self-pleasured, unalived the child by either strangulation or blows, cut the body open, completely emptied out the stomach and the breast cavities, and buried the remains. The variations included cutting the body into little pieces, cutting off the limbs, the head, the parts between legs, putting out the eyes, slicing sections of flesh, which he then smelled, from the buttocks and thighs, and unsuccessful attempts at backdoor, you know what I mean. In the extraordinarily detailed descriptions he gave during preliminary questioning and during the trial, bartsch emphasized that the climax of his arousal did not occur during self-pleasure, but while he was cutting up the bodies, which gave him a kind of continuous orgasm. With the 4th and last unaliving, he finally attained what he had always had in his mind as his ultimate goal. He tied his victim to a post and butchered the child without unaliving him first. When deeds such as these are brought to light, they understandably elicit a wave of outrage, indignation, and horror. People are also amazed that such cruelty is possible at all, especially in the case of a youth who was friendly, likable, intelligent, and sensitive, and who did not show any signs of being a vicious criminal. In addition, his entire background and childhood did not at first glance reveal any special indications of cruelty. He grew up in a conventional middle-class home, like many others, with his share of stuffed animals, in a family it is easy to identify with. People could well say, things were not all that different for us. That's all very normal. Everyone would become a criminal if a childhood like his is supposed to be responsible for what he became. There scarcely seemed to be any other explanation other than this youth had been born abnormal. Even the neurological experts stressed again and again that Bartsch had not been neglected as a child but came from a sheltered background, from a family that had taken good care of him, and he therefore bore full responsibility for his actions. Thus, we have here again, as is the case with the small mustache man, a portrait of innocent, respectable parents whom, for inexplicable reasons, the good Lord or the devil himself presented with a monster. But monsters are not sent into decent middle-class homes from heaven or from hell. Once we have become familiar with the mechanisms that turn child rearing into a form of persecution, identification with the aggressor, splitting off and projection, and the transference of one's own childhood conflicts to the child, then we can no longer be satisfied with antiquated explanations. Moreover, when we realize the powerful effect these mechanisms have on the individual, the intense and compulsive hold that they can exert, we see in the life of every such monster the logical consequences of childhood. I shall attempt to illustrate this in the life of Jurgen Bartsch. But first, I must address the question of why it is so difficult to make psychological findings about the human being accessible to the public. I'm going to skip over it, but basically, somebody who was not from this area was baffled by this. He could not understand why people involved were not aware of these aspects of Bartsch's case that immediately struck him as a foreigner. Naturally, the norms and taboos of a given society are reflected in every courtroom. What a society is not supposed to see will not be seen by its judges or prosecutors either. But it would be too easy to speak only of society here, for the expert and the judges are, after all, human beings as well. Perhaps their upbringing was similar to Jurgen's. They idealized this system from the time they were little and found appropriate methods of discharge. How could they be expected to notice the cruelty of this upbringing without having the whole edifice of their beliefs come tumbling down? It is one of poisonous pedagogy's main goals to make it impossible from the very beginning to see, perceive, and evaluate what one has suffered as a child. Over and over, in the testimony of other experts, we find the characteristic statement that, after all, other people were brought up similarly without becoming essay criminals. In this way, the existing system of child rearing is justified if it can be shown that only a few abnormal people who are its product become criminals. The ensuing acts of revenge can be traced back to the fact that the adult can freely take out his or her aggressions on a child, whereas the child's emotional reactions, which are even more intense than the adult's, must be suppressed by force and by the strongest sanctions. Once we realize how many pent-up feelings and aggressions people who function well and who behave unobtrusively must live with, and the toll this takes on their health, we might well regard it as fortunate, and by no means a matter of course, that everyone does not become a sex offender. There are, to be sure, other ways of learning to live with these pent-up feelings, such as psychosis, addiction, or a perfect adjustment that still enables parents to pass on their bottled-up feelings to their own child. But behind every sexual offense, there are specific factors that occur much more frequently than we are usually ready to admit. They often come to the surface in analysis in the form of fantasies that do not have to be translated into actions, for the simple reason that experiencing these impulses permits their integration and maturation.